when you're presenting, you want to pull your audience in with a great story. And there are some really great tricks that TED Talk presenters use to make that happen. So, we are going to focus in on some basic things that you can do to make your story great. And, many people have written books about how to write a great story and get your story sold. So, here we have a book about writing and getting published by Donald Moss. He's a famous agent. Here we have a book on writing by Susan Cain. And here we have an interesting book on stories called Characters and Viewpoints. So the idea of this book here is to tell a great story. What you need to do is have a compelling character with an interesting point of view. So when it comes to TED Talks, people will often think of the storytelling, the gestures, the personality. We're going to focus in on that, but that's going to be for a different talk. Today, right here in this particular recording, we're going to focus in on narrative structure. So that is how your story is structured, because one of the keys to telling a great story is having a well-structured story. Now, in fiction, there are tricks and strategies that people use, and they're actually very similar to what TED Talk speakers will use. So instead of going through a whole book, I want to keep it simple for you and tell you the basics of narrative structure. So these are the things that you should use to kind of brainstorm ideas. Don't think of it as a like a cooking type instructions, okay? It's not so precise. This is more for brainstorming, it's for inspiration, it's for generating ideas, and it is kind of a checklist to make sure you're not giving a report. A report is when you just say the facts and there's no story. That can be a problem because it can be too dry. You may not pull people in. You may not give people your viewpoint and give them the sense of the person behind the story or the so what behind the facts. So, the very first thing that you should focus on when putting together a story is what's the goal? What are you passionate about? What is important? Number two, what is getting in the way? What is the obstacle? Number three, what are the choices that are being made? And sometimes these choices help, and sometimes these choices hurt. Ultimately, what makes a story interesting, it comes down to the choices we make and what the outcomes are. Okay, so next is epiphany and change. So epiphany is when our viewpoint changes. We have a sudden discovery, and epiphanies are great turning points in stories. Change, well, change is a pretty open concept, but ultimately, when you look at a presentation, that's what the audience cares about. They care about how you, the character in the story, changed, but there's a reason they care about it. They care about it for you, but they also care about it because of the lessons it can teach them. So that's answering the what's in it for me question for the audience. And that brings us exactly to the last thing you really need to focus in on with narrative structure, and that's the lesson learned. So when you get to the conclusion of your speech, there should be some kind of lesson that you have learned that you're sharing with the audience through your story, and that ultimately becomes the theme. So you have to be careful when you're structuring your speech that you make sure you're not just talking about yourself. Great storytelling and presentations, it's not just about you, it's about the audience and how they can relate to you through your story and how they can learn lessons that will help them in their life in some way. So, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a woman named Susan Cain, and she has written a book. I'm grabbing it here called Quiet. And I absolutely love this book. I have a daughter who is an introvert, and this book is all about the power of introverts. So, for me, this is a very interesting book. She's a very interesting presenter. Part of the reason is that she opens up my understanding of introversion so that I can understand myself more to some degree because I'm kind of half introvert, half extrovert, but even more so that I can understand other people and what motivates them and why they respond the way that they do. So she has a lot to offer in terms of her message, in terms of the lessons learned. But for this particular recording, this particular lesson for you here today, I want you to know I think she's a great storyteller, and you can learn a lot from her based on her storytelling. So, we're going to jump into some slides that I've put together, and I'm going to walk you through how she's gone through each of these basic steps of narrative structure. Okay, and we're going to start with the goal. She said, I had a vision of 10 girls sitting in a cabin. Okay, so what she's doing is she's setting the scene for her TED Talk story where she's basically saying, hey, I was 9 years old. I was going to leave home, go to camp for the first time. And she was super excited. Perhaps you could picture being a kid going off to camp for the first time. You might have had a vision about what it was going to be. Well, her vision of what camp was going to be was 10 girls sitting in a cabin, cozily reading books, wearing matching nightgowns. And of course, this is not what camp turned out to be in her story. And lots of times, stories start with us having expectations, and those expectations don't work out. We have goals, expectations, and something gets in the way. Well, in this case, what got in the way was really the norms of the camp. But guess what? If you were to say the social norms of the camp were such that extroversion was valued over introversion, that sounds like a report. Instead, what she did is she said, I brought my books and I was so excited to be able to read with these girls. And I think it's significant that she had the detail of reading, wearing matching nightgowns, having the sense of belonging to the group. It's almost like a uniform that she was imagining. And reading was going to be the way to be connected with these girls. That's what she imagined. Didn't work out. Instead, what happened is she had to give a cheer. And the cheer was to develop camp spirit. And it's great how she reenacts it. So you should definitely watch how she reenacts it. She does the cheer. She's like a cheerleader. At the end, she says rowdy, just like showing the excitement that she was expected to have. Oftentimes, the obstacles we face in a story can be embodied by actual people. So, in her story, the camp counselor teaching the cheer, expecting this rowdy enthusiasm, this extroversion. That's the embodiment of the cultural norm that she was facing. And so what happened was that after doing the cheer, she wanted to get away from all of that rowdiness and just settle down and read her books. But the popular girl comes over and says, "Why are you being so mellow?" Hence, reading the books is a problem. Later, the camp leader comes over, her cabin leader, and says, "Hey, we all need to work on being outgoing." Basically, being you, being an introvert is a problem. Keep in mind, she didn't say, "I felt insecure being myself." That sounds a little bit like a report. Instead, there was conflict. There was a scene she takes us back to. She recreates that difficult moment where she wants to read her books, but the camp counselor says, "You need to try to be outgoing." So what does she do? She puts her books away, and guess what? This choice. So we've had the goal of basically fitting in at camp. We've had the obstacle of the norm is to be an extrovert, not a reader, not an introvert. And here we have the choice, which is to put the books back in the bag and to hide them under the bed and basically to pass as an extrovert. And it's interesting to me with her storytelling because she said, "I felt as if the books needed me somehow." That's showing some vulnerability. She's sharing her feelings with us. She's letting us know that she felt a sense of disconnection from what was important to her. So for me, that's a very powerful point in this opening story. And just moving along in her TED talk, she moves on from the camp story. And so that's an anecdote, it's a short story. And at this point, she hasn't gone through all of the phases that I'm telling you about. It's still a good little story, though. Um, but what happens with the narrative structure is it continues throughout her TED Talk. So, in a lot of ways, the narrative structure of her TED Talk starts out with the goal of having a sense of belonging, the obstacle that society, that culture, that the camp counselor, that the popular girls, they all expect this extroversion. And so, what she does is she learns to make choices where she is more extroverted. And so, what she says is, "And I made these self negating choices so reflexively." She was conditioned through rewards and punishments to be more extroverted. And so she made life choices that really didn't value her true self. Okay, so moving on. Ultimately, with good stories, change comes after choices. And the change that comes is she writes a book called Quiet. And you know, that's this book that I love. And it's full of research based discoveries that show the world needs introverts. Think of that. That contrasts with the opening image of be rowdy, be rowdy, be rowdy, but don't read books. Be rowdy, be outgoing, but don't be introverted. So, this message in her book, all of this research shows the value of introversion, the value of introversion in schools, the value of introversion in religion, the value of introversion in business, and the value of introversion in leadership. She goes through and tells us all about amazing leaders who were introverts. And so this change, which is really her book, and switching from kind of Susan Cain passing as an extrovert to her embracing her introversion and focusing her research in on it, that's the change. And that's an important part of her TED Talk story. So, what she does in the TED Talk is she shares a lesson, which is ultimately the moral of the story, and it's to value what's in your suitcase and share it and not hide it like the girl at camp. And so, in her TED Talk, she says, "I hope you will open up your suitcase for other people to see. In other words, don't hide yourself. Don't put who you are in a bag and hide it away. Have the courage to open up who you are and share it with other people. In other words, value introversion, because introversion and introverts are important and to be valued. Okay, so let's just do a quick review. What makes a story great? One important part of the answer to that question, especially for public speaking, is narrative structure. You should have a goal, something that you care about, some kind of expectation, some kind of hope, some kind of passion, something that you're going for. But in a good story, ultimately something gets in the way. We call that an obstacle. That creates uncertainty, it creates fear, it creates doubt. And so take a little time to let us know something about your internal self. What were you feeling? Susan Cain felt like when she hid those books away, that somehow she was forsaking the books. Somehow she was losing an important part of herself. Then let us know about what the choices are that you made. Both the choices that move you toward your goal and the choices that move you away from your goal. In Susan Cain's story, she has the choice of hiding her books. She goes through and tells us other choices that are the same kind of choice. It's the choice to be essentially an extrovert and not value her true self. Okay, so the choice of putting the books in the bag and hiding it really becomes a metaphor which symbolizes her message. So, do you have a choice that can become symbolic of something important within your story? Ultimately, great stories have some kind of an epiphany, some kind of discovery that leads to a change. And her discovery, as I said, is simply this discovery that introverts are important and to be valued. And you get some sense of that in her TED talk. She goes through and touches on it. In her book, she goes into so much depth. But I think it's moving to hear about introverted leaders like Gandhi and Mother Teresa, and to hear her message about how introversion and thoughtfulness can be so effective. Okay, so ultimately, that's the lesson that's learned. That introverts need to value themselves, the extroverts need to value introverts, and that as a culture and as a society, that ultimately having a balance, I think, between introversion and extroversion and valuing both really is what we need to do. To me, that's an inspiring message. And it becomes personal because we see how she's changed as an individual. I don't know about you, but I feel kind of sad for a 9-year-old girl that goes off to camp, that leaves her family and feels uncomfortable in a group where she doesn't really belong. Can you imagine going through life trying to be somebody you're not, trying to pass as an extrovert when you really feel introverted? And I think what's really significant and really inspiring about her story is that, to me, and I think to Susan Cain, introversion is being thoughtful, it's reading, it's considering life, and ultimately she shares her thoughts. And so introversion doesn't need to be that you're shy. Introversion doesn't need to be that you're too scared to talk. Introversion is really that you're thoughtful, that you value quiet time. But like Susan Cain, when you have something important to say, you can stand in front of your audience. You can open up that suitcase just like she does on that TED Talk stage, and you can share with people what is important to you. And because you've thought about it and you've considered it, it can be something that is a gift.